Good evening, friends. We're so glad to have, we can do a little of that. Yay! So glad to have you here at Pub Theology, our final Pub Theology of the season this year. I am Mary Lessman. I am Associate for Spiritual Growth here at St. Michael and All Angels, and we're going to start by getting a little musical. So our musical guest this evening is Paul Deemer. Paul is a singer, songwriter, record producer, worship leader, and outreach musician. He performs in a variety of venues, including bars and churches and hospitals here in Dallas and around the country. And he's currently has started as worship leader for a worship service over at our own St. Matthew's Cathedral here in the Episcopal Diocese of Dallas. So you can look that up as well. Paul blends introspection, empathy, and wonder to craft folk music, drawing frequent comparisons to both James Taylor and John Foreman. You can hear his latest album On the Way Back Down wherever you stream your music. Will you please join me in welcoming Paul Deemer?
It's good to be back at Pub Theology. It's a very different year than last year. I'm really grateful that there's more people here this time and we're not wearing masks, and it's a good thing, right? This is a song called On the Way Back Down that was originally inspired by a hike in San Francisco and then later by a story that a friend told me about his first marriage. Climb the tallest mountain in San Francisco, looking for a melody way up in the canopy, where redwoods seen more sorrow than I could know. Higher than the Golden Gate, foggy like a cityscape. But on the way down, I looked down at the ground and saw a system of roots beneath. The roots under my feet were holding up them trees and bringing the mountain together. And you notice different things, you notice different things. You notice different things on the way back down. He got a little buzz around his first release. The crowds were getting bigger, so his agent pulled the trigger and shot him to a stardom he'd never known. Waving like a lighter, his future growing brighter. But as he looked down at New York on the ground, he knew what fame could never fix. His wife was back at home as he stood there all alone above a city that never sleeps. And you notice different things, you notice different things, you notice different things on the way back down. And you notice different things, you notice different things, you notice different things on the way back down. You bottled up your pain until it ran all over. Your words were getting sharper and my heart was getting harder. I wondered if we'd make it through a night so dark. I faced you like a fighter and held you that much tighter. And as we looked down, our tears, they hit the ground, sowing seeds for morning's mercy. Now we're digging in the dirt, pulling up the buried hurt as a garden grows beneath. And you notice different things, you notice different things, you notice different things on the way back down. Yeah, and you notice different things, you notice different things, you notice different things on the way back down. And you notice different things on the way back down. You notice different things on the way back down. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you so much. We're going to get to hear more from Paul a little later in the program. I'd like to take a minute to tell you a little bit about what we're doing here with Pub Theology. We have had this idea of offering something where we can invite people who may not already be involved in a church community and who might even be a little skeptical about church communities to come to a place that feels kind of easy and safe for them, where we offer an interesting theological topic, where there's no expectation on them other than for them to come if they're curious and engage. And usually we offer this in an actual pub. And so we'll be out in a rowdy space and eating and drinking there. And so that's even a lower barrier to entry for those who are not part of a church community. But of course, as everything changed with COVID, so did that. And so we look forward to next June being back in a pub to carry on our old model. Let me tell you a little bit about who we are as St. Michael, in case you are watching, if you're live streaming or if you're new with us. We are an Episcopal church here in Dallas, Texas. Bob Johnston, who leads this program, but also will be actually as our speaker for this evening as well, leads our contemporary worship here at St. Michael. And so the contemporary worship service is at 11 o'clock here. We also have a traditional service at 9 o'clock. And then we have some other services. And again, post-COVID, now that we're opening up, our worship service will expand starting in the fall. So we invite you to just keep your eye out for what our service schedule will be starting then. We're located, for those of you viewing from afar, near Preston Center. So we're on Douglas, just south of Northwest Highway. We invite you to come and find us. And you can find out more information about us by looking on our website at stmichaelspelledout.org. Now I want to give you a little overview about what the evening will be like for those of you who might be new this evening. We're going to have a talk on the topic for 30 or 45 minutes. We're going to have a brief 10-minute break. And during that break, Paul will be back up playing music for us. And then what's going to happen is we're going to have a question and answer period, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about that. And that will go for about 20 minutes. So what you'll notice is on your tables, you have some Q&A cards. And so during the program, as you think of questions, we invite you to write those down. Because what we'll do is during that 10-minute break, we're going to walk around and collect those questions, and we're going to give them to our speaker, and he's going to be able to kind of organize them and then come up and do Q&A for 20 minutes or so with you. Also on the table, I'm going to draw your attention to the fact that we have a survey. So please, we invite you to fill out that survey form as well. A lot of our topics that we choose for the next year are based on your feedback on those surveys. So please let us know what you're interested in hearing us talk about and engage, especially as you think from the perspective of those who are not currently churched or currently believers. I am supposed to, at this point, give you a disclaimer that the views of the speaker are not the views of St. Michael. And so know that they are speaking for themselves. But seeing as Bob is on staff here, I think we're blurring the lines tonight. So. And now let me take a minute to introduce Bob. Most of you know him well and probably don't need to hear an introduction, but some of you might know him well and not know all of this stuff. So we're gonna make sure we let you get to know him a little bit better. Bob is our associate for contemporary worship here at St. Michael. He started Pub Theology at St. Michael here about 3 years ago, but he had started a similar ministry almost 20 years ago at a different Episcopal church. So I wouldn't have put 20 years in there because it dates him so bad. And most people probably think he's younger, but yeah, he started that 20 years ago. And while he usually is on the organizing side of this event, as I mentioned earlier, he has in the past spoken on different topics, including hypocrisy in the church and Christians and alcohol. He studied engineering at Baylor, where he also minored in religion. He has graduate degrees in theology, law, and business from SMU, Southern Methodist University. Bob's a bivocational priest, which means he has a day job as well as his ministry through the church. And in his day job, Bob practices intellectual property law. He helps clients with trademarks and patents. So please join me in welcoming Father Bob Johnston, who will be speaking on cancel culture.
Thanks, Mary. Appreciate it. It's great to be with you guys this evening on this side of the podium speaking. I want to start with a story before we kind of back up and get some structure to how we're going to do this evening. This story is the saga of Carson King. And some of you who watch ESPN a lot or are in the sports world will probably already know this story from a couple years ago. This took place in 2019. But I'll just tell you how this story goes, and we can begin to think about some of the different layers that are involved in this thing. But this all started with, if you've ever watched ESPN on a Saturday during football season, they have one game that they choose where they send one of their teams, and they have the college game day. And they set out they usually broadcast outside, and all the students come up behind them and go crazy, and they do all this stuff before the game actually starts. Well, back in the fall of 2019, on this particular day, they were at Iowa State. And this guy, Carson King, decides that he's going to work his way up near where they're broadcasting from, right behind them. And eventually he holds up a sign which read, "Busch Light Supply needs replenishment." And it gave a Venmo address. And happily for him, people responded well to it. And money started pouring in. And when he saw that it was going to be a lot more than just a case of Busch beer, he quickly put out on social media that he was going to give the money that was raised to the University of Iowa Stead Family Children's Hospital. So then the money really started to increase, and it kind of went viral. And then Anheuser-Busch, not to miss out on this opportunity, quickly chimed in and said, well, we'll match everything that everybody gives to this, and we'll give him a year supply of Busch Light. And then Venmo said, well, we'll kick in on this too. And so you had all these people going. And in fact, Anheuser-Busch said, we're on this year supply, and said, we're going to actually print up some cans that'll have his picture on it. And we're going to call him the Iowa Legend. And so all this stuff is just growing, and he's raising all kinds of money on this deal. And then so the local newspaper, the Des Moines Register, decides, well, this is newsworthy. We're going to write an article on this. And they assign one of the reporters, a guy named Aaron Carter, to write a story about him. And so he writes this story, and part of his research, he does a deep dive on his background. And in the course of this, he finds that, I didn't say it before this, but Carson King is 24 years old when all this is taking place. But when he was 16 years old, he reposted a couple jokes that were not appropriate. They were from some show, and to be honest with you, I don't know what the show is, but he reposted these, and they were racial jokes, and they were inappropriate jokes. And so the reporter calls him and says to him, hey, I got these old tweets. It's going to be part of the article, whatever else. And I don't know whether Carson King was a media major or what, but he gets in front of this thing. He called his own press conference before the article comes out to try to get in front of this, because he knows this is not a good thing that's going on. And these are some of the things that Carson King says between the press conference and the statement that he puts out with the press conference. I just want to let you hear some of the kind of things he's saying. I'm embarrassed and stunned to reflect on what I thought was funny when I was 16 years old. I want to sincerely apologize. He went on, obviously, I've made mistakes in my past. Everyone has. And I really hope people see at this point in my life, I'm grown, I'm caring, I'm generous. I hope that is what people focus on. He said, thankfully, high school kids grow up and hopefully become responsible and caring adults. I think my feelings are better summed up by a post from 3 years ago. Until we as people learn that racism and hate are learned behaviors, we won't get rid of it. Tolerance towards others is the first step. He went on in the statement to say, I cannot go back and change what I posted when I was 16 years old. I can apologize and work to improve every day and make a meaningful difference in people's lives. Put that out there. That was the conference. That was the statement. It didn't matter. So Anheuser-Busch canceled everything with him and disassociated with him. They did say, we'll continue to give the monies that we said to the Children's Hospital, and we'll add to it the monetary equivalent of a year supply of Busch Light, which we're taking away from him. But we're not done with the story yet. So then the what sometimes people call the online mob, I don't mean to say that in a bad way, but the online mob turns then on the newspaper. and everybody gets red hot that this person that Iowa legend, it was going to be on the can, is now, all the sponsors are disassociating from him and all this. And so the executive editor defends the paper and says, the hardest part of being a journalist is to figure out what to include and not to include and all these things, but everybody's attacking them. But along the way, when everybody's attacking the newspaper, somebody decides to do a deep dive on the reporter. Well, apparently, as they did a deep dive on him, he had also done offensive, racist tweets. And in time, this leads to his being let go from the newspaper. So then after he's let go, then he's willing to speak about it. And Aaron Carter said this. He says, many of these tweets are inappropriate, and I wouldn't have published them today, though I contend that most were simply unfortunate, removed from context, or the result of an attempt at ironic humor, and by no means a meaningful reflection of my values. But again, he ultimately lost his job and at the paper over this whole thing. And we're not done yet. The local Oktoberfest promoters then came out and said, well, we're not going to have Busch Light this year. And the thing just keeps going. And it makes me wonder about some of the commentators that get into cancel culture, talk about when you run this thing to the ground and just keep going, the only place this thing goes is to self-extinction. But we'll talk about that in just a bit. I think that I do want to end that story, though, on a good note. At the end of the day, he was not fully canceled. The money still kept coming in. More people actually got invigorated by it at some level. At the end of the day, he handed a check over to the University of Iowa Stead Family Children's Hospital for a little over $3 million when it all settled. So that's a story that has a bunch of stuff going on in it. And we're going to start to kind of look at what this is and what's happening with all that in just a moment. But I do want to tee a few things up for the night's talk in terms of getting things set for what we're doing with this. And before we do that, Mary gave the disclaimer. I'm going to add to it and just say, this is what I think today after having a burrito and at lunch. And, I'm not speaking for the church or any other organization and, a whole bunch of other things like this. And I'll also say that I'm not an expert in this field per se, but I am diligent. I've read about 30 articles in the last couple months, and I've solicited input from Facebook, and I've done lots of different things to try to be diligent in the presentation of this material today. And my hope is that this will be an opportunity for all of us to think about this further and to grow and to maybe engage it a little bit more. I'd also encourage you to, if you already know this topic tonight well, I want to encourage you to try to listen particularly hard to the views that are opposite from what you hold. I gave a talk. This is probably one of the most controversial topics I've done. The second most controversial one, I won't go into the details of it, but I gave a talk and I presented two views. And when the night was over, it was clear to me that people only listen to their own view and to get validated. And so people didn't really listen to the other side. So I want to just encourage you to try to hear all the sides of this thing. And then the final thing I want to really kind of say is I actually am speaking because I couldn't find anybody who wanted to speak on this topic. And that is the truth. That is absolutely the truth. I'd rather be back there drinking my beer. So have some grace. Like I'm trying to do something good. I'm trying to get some conversation going. If you think you heard something that was wrong, you didn't hear it correctly. Have some grace with me. Don't cancel me. And of course, everybody's already going on. The AV guys have already told me if I don't stay on my time, they're going to cancel me. I think they're going to put on a sports show. This is where we're going to go tonight. I want to talk about what is cancel culture. What is the kind of the definition of it? How do we understand it? I want to back up and ask the question before we bring faith explicitly into it. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? What's it do for society? And then I want to pivot and talk about how do Christians approach it? Or what are some ideas or reflections about how Christians might approach this topic? That's where I want to go with this. And there was a Pew Research survey that was done earlier this year. The results came out earlier this year that frankly surprised me a lot because I won't go into all the details of this survey, but one of the top line pieces of data from it was that like 38% of people in the United States don't know what cancel culture is and really haven't heard much about it, which is just shocking to me because it seems like it's everywhere that all the media sources I'm in, you see, it seems to be a lot of discussion about it. So because of that, before I jump into some of the precise definitions that people offer for what it is, I want to give just briefly, in summary form, a number of other examples of some of the things that have hit the press in the last couple of years. I think about one of these is from, I think last summer, Neil Golightly, who was the chief communications officer for Boeing, resigning because it came to pass that employees discovered that 30 years before, he'd written an article arguing that women should not go into combat. 30 years later, they get a lot of pressure around that, and these employees, and they go after him, and ultimately, for the good of the company, he resigns. Or we think about one of the trustees for Gettysburg College who's pressured to quit because of something 38 years ago when he was in college. He went to a fraternity party that was themed Hogan's Heroes Party, and he went dressed in a Nazi outfit. Now, for those of you who are of a certain age, younger than me, and Mary, for the record, I did start at age 10. But for those who don't know Hogan's Heroes, go watch it. But the whole thing is a comedy about set in a concentration camp, which may sound insensitive in itself, but that's what it was. And one of the lead stars, not Hogan, but the Commandant Warren Klemperer was the actor who played him, was Jewish. And he played the German commandant of the whole place. But anyway, so he dresses up as this, as a Hogan's hero and goes to this party. It surfaces 38 years later. The students get a hold of it. I don't know if they ever watched the show or not. But anyway, long story short, he ends up being pressured to resign. And that wasn't enough, because then some of the professors at the university also said that the donations that he had made should be returned. That's just another example. I want to mention also Bill Cosby, because there's something a little bit unique about that one. That's, back in 2018, he was found guilty of drugging and assaulting a woman, and then there was accusations that came out of something like 50 other women who claimed to have similar things that happened with Bill Cosby. That one is interesting because he got canceled. All his stuff is taken off of reruns, and all the different aspects are done, but also the legal system did its job in that he's convicted and put away. So oftentimes, we'll say this in a minute, but it's cancel culture oftentimes involves things that don't involve a law being broken. There are other things, norms or expectations that are being violated, but not the law. But in that case, it was. And then I want to do one more example, just in a touch more detail, because I don't want you to feel too comfortable. This is one where you might start to think, well, this is only public people. You got to be an officer in a company. You've got to be a celebrity. You have to be a sports star. You've got to be somebody if you're going to be canceled. Well, this is from a couple years ago. There are a bunch of software folks attending what's called a PyCon conference, which is an open source language, Python programming. They're all at this big conference, and these two guys are sitting watching this speaker come up and give his talk, and one of them makes some kind of alleged sexual loaded joke. And for those of you who know computer stuff, it involved a dongle. You can fill in some of what they might have said. That's a computer part. Don't cancel me, please. But behind them is a woman named Andrea Richards, and whatever it is, she took offense at this private discussion between them. And so what she does is she takes a picture of them where you can see their faces, and then she posts it with what they said, whatever joke they had said. She puts it out there. And what happens after that is the following day, the employer of one of these guys that gets the photograph taken, he works for a software development company, they terminate him over the joke that he said sitting in an audience in private. And then what happens next is this gets out on the internet, what's happened. In response to this, Richards, her public shaming and what she puts out there, this whole group of people that are out there, probably all these software guys, they do what's called a DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service attack, on her employer, SendGrid. And according to John Ronson, who with the New York Times, he says that they told the employer that the tax would stop if Richards was fired. So SendGrid subsequently terminated her employment later that same day, citing Richards dividing the very community she was hired to unite. So then PyCon, the people who put on this conference every year, about that time, they update their attendance rules to say this: public shaming can be counterproductive to building a strong community. PyCon does not condone nor participate in such actions out of respect. You don't have to be a public figure. These guys are sitting in the audience, and that's what goes on. So how do we take all these different things? They're way, I could go on all night with all kinds of different examples about what happens, and they could be very quick. I'll say more about that in a second. But this idea, as we start to talk about what is this, I mean, part of what we stop with is that public shaming is not something new, okay? That happens basically in every culture. It's happened through the ages. It's a way of basically of groups forcing public norms on different folks in different ways. And really, if you look at it, even Jesus on the cross, the sign over him is a way of public shaming. Crucifixion itself is a public shaming and a way to try to control the crowds and enforce different kinds of norms. What's new about this and what changes things is how social media has the ability to amplify this. The speed and the scope and the impact of it all being called out through social media changes that whole thing. So then that's the setting of what we do and why it's new. And that's what people begin to talk about cancel culture. So I want to give you, I want to say, first of all, that, having read these 30-something articles and done this different aspects of research, this is still kind of fluid. People are still getting their minds around what this is, how to define it, how the different pieces fit. And so I want to read a number of different definitions of cancel culture so you can see some of the variations that people include or encompass in this. One definition says cancel culture has been described as removing of support for public figures in response to their objectionable behavior or opinions. This can include boycotts or refusals to promote their work. Another says cancel culture, also known as call-out culture, I'll talk about that in a second, is a removal or canceling of support for an individual and their work due to an opinion or action on their part deemed objectionable to the parties calling them out. Still another, this is from a New York Times article, cancel culture or call-out culture describes a form of ostracism in which someone or something is thrust out of social or professional circles, either online, on social media, in the real world, or both. They're said to be canceled. Professor Ann Charity Hudley, an expert in African American culture and linguistics at the University of California, Santa Barbara, she breaks it down in saying that there are really kind of two parts to this, or two definitions to it. This is how she says. And she says the first one is essentially a boycott. And this is a quote. She says, "It is the withdrawal of financial support, political support, social, economic support, often in pop culture in the form of attention of a particular media star, a political figure, a business type. And withdrawing publicly your support in a way that informs other people that should withdraw their support as well." And then the second part of it, she says, the second definition, that is silencing something or somebody. And they overlap, but it's a little bit different because one is more about withdrawing your attention and the other is actively seeking to stop someone from speaking. That's how she says it. I've got two more definitions I want to give, so hold with me. New York Times columnist Ross Douthat, I don't know how you pronounce it, says this: "You are not being canceled." He's going to say what it's not. "You're not being canceled if you're merely being heckled or insulted. No matter how vivid and threatening the heckling becomes, you are decidedly at risk of cancellation, however, if your critics are calling for you to be deplatformed or fired or put out of business." And then finally, I want to read one. This is going to, I'll say something about politics in a minute. This is going to be a very right definition of it, coming from Forbes magazine. This is from one of their contributors, Evan Gerstmann. He says, "It's a highly punitive approach to disagreement or perceived transgressions based on strict fidelity to ideology that elevates performative outrage over dialogue, factual inquiry or respect for values such as free speech or fair process. It rejects the values of ideological diversity. It's often exercised by powerful corporations, editors, academic administrators, or unaccountable attackers operating through anonymous social media platforms. It rejects the distinction between offenses and harm, between disagreement and discrimination, and between words and actions. It often reduces complex issues to a binary view, such as one can only be anti-racist or racist. It rejects the importance of a person's intent in making a statement and refuses to take into account how long ago the statement was made, the person's age at the time they made it, or whether the statement in any way reflects a person's current thinking. So there's a whole lot of, you can get an idea, there's lots of different definitions and thoughts about it, but you can kind of start to get the main tenets of what's involved in it. The way this typically plays out is somebody does something that's perceived as being inappropriate, then they're called out in social media in a way that invites others to join in, and then others join in a way that brings about the cancellation. That's the way it flows. And this can happen really, really quickly, the way the internet works and the way these different platforms work. And the example that's oftentimes given for that is related to a public relations executive, a woman named Justine Sacco. She tweeted an offensive joke involving AIDS right before she got on a plane to fly from London to South Africa. By the time she landed in South Africa, she had been called out, canceled, and fired in the time from London to South Africa. So these things can happen very, very quickly. I don't really know what to do this next section, but I know I need a placeholder here. There's a political dimension to this that's hard, that is still kind of hard to describe what's going on with it. I'm going to say later, I want us to get beyond thinking about the different political sides of things, but clearly the Republicans have got a view on this and Democrats have a view on this, and people view it differently. I'll give you an example of this from this past February. Republicans at the high-profile conservative CPAC event, they talked a lot about cancel culture. And one of the percolating phrases coming around is uncancel America. And all of these different things like this. And then the left comes back after hearing this and argues that cancel culture is no more than a political slogan of the right. And so you have all these different things going on with this. One commentator says that all of this flows out of identity politics, that it all stems from, it's really a symptom that flows out of those different kinds of places. Others today will say that the right likes it because it gives them a place to hide. They can just say, well, people are trying to cancel me, instead of trying to deal with whatever the real complaint is or what's involved with it. So there are lots of different things percolating on the political front. That's a placeholder. I don't have time to go into a further dive on that. What I'd like to do before I pick up the Christian piece of this is present to you some thoughts, because one of the conversations I'd love for you to have is this ultimately a good thing or a bad thing for society, for the good of society? And I want to try to do some pro and cons. And as we do that, I'm going to give a shout out, because it was hard to get good input on both of these. But Britannica's pro-con website had some great stuff there. I solicited some stuff from Facebook, from friends there that were very valuable, so I want to appreciate the people who put in on that. But let me give you a number of things that are on the pro side. This is the position that's saying this thing that's happening, that's being called cancel culture, is a good thing. It's a net good for society. And the first reason that might be put out there for this is that call-out culture is bringing accountability to certain people who before may have been outside of the justice system in a way. It's calling them to account. And it's coming from people that maybe didn't have power, the people who are marginalized that are suddenly getting some power on this. Let me give you a quote on this to think about. This is from Olivia Godhill, who's a science reporter for Quartz. She says, men have sexually assaulted and harassed women with impunity for millennia. Incredibly, ever since the allegations against Hollywood impresario Harvey Weinstein stopped being an open secret, a few famous men have finally faced repercussions for their actions. Where inept courts and HR departments have failed, a new tactic has succeeded. women talking publicly about harassment on social media, fueling the public condemnation that's forced men from their jobs and destroyed their reputations. That's an example of it. And the one that gets quoted a lot is Harvey Weinstein. Because people would say that he lawyered up whenever he got accused or different things were going on, and he was always able to avoid it. But then when this whole Me Too thing started, then had its roots to go into cancel culture, made so much pressure on the legal system and the justice system that it ultimately caught up with him, is how they would say. And as you know, he's now convicted of a third-degree rape and a first-degree criminal sexual assault. Meredith Clark, who's a media studies professor at the University of Virginia, says that cancel culture serves a purpose when it gives underrepresented groups the ability to hold the powerful accountable. To her, it's about punching up from where you are. So that's the first reason, is really the benefit of it may be that it provides accountability for people who've been able to avoid it in the past, and provides that. And the second reason given is really very closely related to the first, is that it provides voice to those who have been marginalized in the past and who didn't have power in the past. It's giving them a voice. So the disenfranchised are the less powerful people. Osita Nomanavu, a journalist, I could spell this to you, but anyway, trust me. She says it this way: the critics of cancel culture are plainly threatened not by a new and uniquely powerful kind of public criticism, but by a new set of critics, young progressives, including many minorities and women who largely through social media have obtained a seat at the table where matters of justice and etiquette are debated and are banging it loudly to make up for lost time. I quoted this professor, Ann Hudley, a few minutes ago, the chair of the linguistics at California State. She says this: canceling is a way to acknowledge that you don't have to have power to change structural inequality. You don't have to have the power to change all of the public sentiment. But as an individual, you can still have power beyond measure online. And for Black culture and cultures of people who are lower income and disenfranchised, this is the first time you do have a voice in those types of conversations. That's the second statement of a positive position, is that it brings a voice that's not been at the table into it. The third reason is very simply that it's just another form of boycott. And that's been the backbone of so many different social movements, the civil rights movement, all these things. It's just another form and fashion of that. So those are on the positive side. I want to mention a few that are on the con side that are saying that this is not a good thing. And I'll present a few more of these because more have been presented. The first of these I'll mention is that it stifles real debate. And one of the things I would point to on this is a letter that appeared in Harper's Magazine that was called A Letter on Justice and Open Debate. And there were 153 well-known writers and authors who signed that, including J.K. Rowling and public intellectuals. Later, two of them withdrew their support from that. But what they warn of a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences in favor of ideological conformity. One writer, who's Alexandra Diamore, talks about one of her events where she is speaking at an event in Santa Cruz, California, about shame and privilege. And she tells in one of her articles about how this white woman comes up to her afterwards, and she said this, quote, "I'm afraid that if I say or ask the wrong thing, I'll get canceled." And the article, she starts with that and she reflects on it, and she writes about what this is, that somebody would be afraid to even engage in a conversation or even ask a question over fear of being canceled. So that's part of it. Does it actually stifle debate? Another would say that, well, it's just not effective. That's another way that some people will look at this. Roman Catholic writer Sencha Fisher says, "It feels virtuous and embracing, as if you're scouring out the corners of some filthy room to usher in health and healing. But in practice, what often happens is that people who are mostly innocent are seriously injured, or they're so offended that they dig in. And rather than examining their errors and making changes, rather than bringing about a correction of an error, call-out culture often ends up entrenching people in their mistakes. You know, as I read that, I meant to mention this back when I was talking about the definitions. There's not great clarity about the difference between call-out culture and cancel culture. Some people will say they're synonyms, and some people will say that cancel culture is a child of call-out culture. The call-out culture is publicly bringing out the issue, and that cancel culture is when everybody jumps in to say, down with this thing. So, but people sometimes treat it as a synonym when you hear it. When we make this point about it not being effective, I'd also invite you to listen to the words from President Obama from just a couple years ago. It says, quote, like if I tweet or hashtag about how you didn't do something right or use the wrong verb, then I can sit back and feel pretty good about myself. Because, man, you see how woke I was? I called you out. That's not activism. That's not bringing about change. If all you're doing is casting stones, you're probably not going to get that far. That's easy to do. That's what he says. Others say that cancel culture is a form of online bullying. Certainly, one reporter, Assam Ahmad, says that's what it is. People can think about whether that's true or not. Others say that it's a slippery slope that leads towards complete intolerance. Call-out culture. Let me give one quote here. I'll keep moving along. Stephen Mintz, professor emeritus at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, says that some members of the canceling group join in for fear of being canceled themselves. People should be able to speak out or remain silent on issues without the fear of retribution. He continues by saying that we need more tolerance and willingness to allow the existence of opinions and behavior that one does not necessarily agree with and not seek to harm the offender. The final thing on this side of saying it's not necessarily a good thing is whether or not there's any sense of fairness or any kind of sense of due process in what takes place. Because in a very real sense, there can be allegations. Somebody can make a case, whether it's true or not, and what safeguards are there, and what abilities are appeal, and where are your peers and all this. But people can make the case, and everybody jumps in, and nobody's really looked at the evidence very hard or under rules and what have you. And so the people involved can become the judge, the jury, and the executor all at once. Some people have likened it, obviously people who are against it, have likened it to the Salem witch trials or McCarthyism. So there are lots of different things that people would put out on both sides, and I hope you'll listen to whatever side you're not on and try to hear what might be there. What we do know is that if it is a form of bullying, it actually hurts both of them, both sides. They've done studies on this, right? This is from a 2020 study that found if it is cyberbullying, if you get to that place where you believe that, 39% of cyberbullying victims and 29% of cyberbullies themselves show signs of PTSD. And they've done various, there's been a couple documentaries now done where they've gone back and followed people who've been the victims of cancel culture, whether they deserved it or not, I'm not trying to go into. But many of them go to really dark places and contemplate suicide. And there are lots of articles talking about, is that really what we want to do? I want to turn for the final part of this talk and talk about Christian engagement on this issue. And hang on, I'm going to stop my timer before it goes off. I want to first, in sort of a plea for humility amongst Christians, I want to start by the suggestion that's been made that maybe Christians are the ones who've started this thing going, right? That there are a number of articles that are out there that suggest that certainly as cancel culture has made its way now into canceling parts of the church and Christians that do certain things, that people are reaping what they sowed. Jonathan Merritt is a journalist who recently wrote an article on this, and he says, look, he kind of traces out the history and says, following all the upheaval of the 1960s and sort of the shift that happened where we came to a different kind of pluralism in the United States about how things were being handled, that there was this whole part of the church, the evangelical church in particular, that rejected that whole notion and decided they would go for cultural separatism and try to distance and ostracize parts of culture that they didn't agree with. And he would go on to point out, he traces this stuff, but he picks up, I'm going to pick up in the 1990s, he would talk about how the 16 million member of the Southern Baptist Convention in 97 boycotts Walt Disney World for being too gay friendly. Or how Jerry Falwell in 99 goes after the Teletubbies because one of the characters, Tinky Winky, was said to be covertly gay. Or in 2012, how the 1 Million Moms, part of the American Family Association, led a boycott against JCPenney because it gripes about Ellen DeGeneres as being their spokesperson as an out lesbian. Or more recently, some of the Christian writers of the last decade, one may think of Rob Bell, the mega pastor who was put out for writing his book, Love Wins, where he openly questions whether there is a hell and whether or not that's consistent with an all-loving God. What purpose does hell have? And all these kinds of questions he raised, and he was pushed out of his church and where he went from there as a form of that. Or more recently, Jen Hatmaker and Rachel Evans having their books pulled off of the Christian bookstore shelves because of their views in supporting same-sex marriages. And all these different kinds of things. Now, I think that there is also a shift that takes place in 2016 because I do believe that within the Christian world in the United States, there's a much bigger divide now between evangelicals and the rest of the Christian brothers and sisters in America in 2016. They kind of took, I think, a bigger split. But the question is, did Christianity bring a lot of this about? Rachel Hewitt, writing for Relevant Magazine recently, said the Christian church at large, if we're honest, has long participated in cancel culture via excommunication, community rejection, and shunning of entire people groups for its entire history. She gives as an example back whenever Christian singer and songwriter Amy Grant divorced, all the boycotts that went out saying don't buy her music, don't carry her music, all the different things that happened. All of that is just a moment of saying, I think Christians ought to have a lot of humility in approaching the whole topic. And what I'd like to do, so with the time I have left, I want to say, I think whatever a Christian response is to this whole cancel culture, there are certain commitments we have to hold to and how we navigate it. And then I'm going to give some ideas about maybe what our approach should be, just for thought. But I think whenever we talk about what our commitments are that we have to hold in all of this, Christians are all about the dignity of everyone, period. Period. Like whether or not it's the person you find the most reprehensive in the world or it's the person you love the most, we view the dignity of all humans. That's part of how we're called to be. That's how the church has always taught. That's what we see in Scripture. I think also with that we have to hold up that God never gives up on people. So there's something that is kind of hard and doesn't sit well when we look at it, to the extent that culture is saying we're done with you and we never want to see you again because we've given up on you. That goes against this whole notion of God not giving up on people. And there are lots of different ways that we can think about that. I was impressed by one professor, Loretta Rose of Smith College in Massachusetts. She writes about how she used to hate white supremacists. And her attitude was, I don't feel bad about hating them because I know they hate me. And she went on to talk about how that changed for her whenever she runs this organization that helps different people with some of these different issues. And they had a white supremacist who had a son that was born with a cleft lip. And that experience changed him because he was like, my son doesn't deserve to be discriminated against or even exterminated, as some had told him or whatever. And he wanted to change. And so he came to her organization wanting to unlearn all the things that he had learned. And she said that whole experience of seeing how even radicals can be reachable changed her, that she doesn't give up on people now. And God never gives up. He never gives up on people, and that's part of what we hold. And I've preached on this before, so I'm not going to quote it or anything other than do a placeholder here. One of my favorite songs on the planet on this regard is to listen to U2's To the End of the World, because it's a love song between Judas and Jesus, and it's fantastic. The other thing I think we hold as a principle always, is that we as Christians need to own, and we don't do this well, I don't think, that we're both good and bad. And you don't have to read more than 3 chapters of Scripture to get it. That God, go back to Genesis 1 and start there, but God creates us and says, look, that's good. And he creates us in his image. So we're made in God's image, but then we have the fall. So we got this thing that we're made in God's image and we're good, but then we've fallen. And so it's not a surprise to Christians that people are both good and bad. That you walk around, everybody in this room, our conviction is you're both good and bad. And what do we do with that? But that's one of the things that we hold. And the rest of society may forget this part about being fallen, but Christians should not. That's part of what we do. And then the 2 things I want to say are we always have to be about love. Jesus said as much. God loves, period. It's not about perfect conduct. God engages the world in love. He wants us to be known by love. He calls us into love. He does everything he can do to make that message clear that we're to be about love. And I think when you get confused sometimes, honestly, if you get deeply confused on something, just ask what's maximum love and go that direction. And the final sort of tenet that I think we have to hold in all this is that we're called to be citizens of above. And that means to transcend being Republican or a Democrat. That we're meant to think about an eternal purpose, a bigger construct, an idea that we're meant to be citizens of above. So what is our approach? What do we do with this? I want to suggest that one of the first things that we do is we don't cancel people. We just don't, we want to be really clear about that. We may go after ideas. We may go after conduct. We may go after these different things, but we never are about canceling people. And if you were raised in different educational environments where people were setting rules about arguments, you always heard that you were not supposed to engage in ad hominem arguments where you're attacking the person and not the ideas of the debate or whatever else it is. Now, it does get challenging because is there an objective truth nowadays? Do we believe that there's some kind of something that we all know or not? Or is it just our preferences? These all get involved, but we don't cancel people. We engage on the different ideas. The second kind of thing that we bring in this is to be mature and secure in our identity in Christ. And what I mean by this, and for this, I'm going to throw, some of this is coming from Father Mike Schmitz, if some of y'all know who he is. But if you're going to be mature and secure in your identity in Christ, just start out by saying, I'm not going to be offended. And part of this is saying, look, if somebody's, this is when you're on the receiving end of it. If what they're saying is true, then it's true. Learn from it. If it's not true, then don't worry about it. You know it. You know better. But what we get into a real difficult situation is when we have something that is true, but we kind of wish it wasn't. And we want to try to defend ourselves against it. So that's a maturity question. Or maybe an idea here too is to what extent should we even be cancelable? If we're living very secure in knowing who we are as a child of God, as a beloved of God, are we that affected by whether we're getting the approval of this group or this person or that person? And I remembered a book that I read to my boys when they were young from Max Lucado on this point. Some of y'all may have read it, but the title of the book is called You're Special. It's a children's book. And it's these little puppet things that are made in the craftsman's shop, but they go around trying to get gold stars. Or if they do something bad, they get circles put on them. And there's suddenly the one character we're following is this guy named Punchinello. And he eventually encounters this girl named Lucia. And she has no stars or no circles. And he's like, how did you do that? And she says, well, you need to go up and meet the maker, Eli. And so he eventually travels up to the workshop and meets Eli. And Eli explains to him that if you get to the place where you're not bothered by what others think, the stars and the dots don't stick on you. And it's a great book. It's a great book. I actually, when I first read it, I was like, I wish I could just read that as a sermon sometime. It'd be too short. No, that's an inside joke. And then, so I've got 2 more things I want to say, and then we'll take a break. I think also Christians, we have to engage in the hard work of love. I think we have to stay committed to the hard work of love, which means that we have to listen. It means we have to care and love all the people of our society. And one of the things I think it's a great question to ask, I've got this one counselor that I see who will sometimes say to me, what are you learning from that pain? Like, sit with that pain. What are you learning from it? And I think to whatever extent we see the pain in cancel culture, what is it society should be learning from that pain? One of the things that we may need to learn is that justice isn't working for everybody. Like, there's some sense in which people are feeling like justice isn't happening, or there needs to be more discussion on this. I'm not saying that that's the case, but it's something we've got to engage. And Jesus calls us to love even our enemies. Jesus calls us to turn our cheek. All these different things are the hard work of love. Or maybe the hardest thing is if you have a friend that gets canceled, standing by them. I had one of my best friends from high school who went to prison a few years ago. And I went out of my way to make sure he knew that I still loved him, that he was still a friend. Because that's a lonely place to be when people start doing that. And then along with that, as I said, turn your other cheek. We're not going to retaliate. The final thing that I want to say is to keep a personal, a deep perspective on all this. I don't think Christians should be surprised at how difficult it can be to live out our faith, that all this stuff is going to happen. I mean, we know that Jesus was wrongly convicted, wrongly sentenced, wrongly crucified. The whole thing is wrong. Why do we ever expect that this is going to work out differently? We're all going to face things that are not fair and that there's injustices on this. And I think we're called to take a bigger perspective and keep loving and keep working. And, I'll tell you that for me, raising teenage boys right now they're young men. I'm raising them, white young men in our society today. And a lot of society doesn't have great things to say, or so it would seem. And what do we do with that? Whenever we hear something that kind of smacks, I just stop and say, let's pray for the equal dignity of all and for love. That's what I pray. And I think we just got to keep hard, fast holding on to that and trying to live into that and keep asking God's Spirit to move and bring about love and bring about a community that's known for love. We'll take Q&A in just a bit. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. All right, while Paul's coming up to entertain us again with more music, I want to call your attention again to the question slips on your table. If you have any questions on the topic for Bob, please fill them out and hold them up. Is that what we're doing? Hold them up, friends? And we will be collecting those so that Bob can answer those for you. We're going to take a 10-minute break, but as we do so, we would love you to stay seated and attentive for our program. Thanks. Paul.
So I love themes, and when I heard that tonight was going to be themed around cancel culture, I looked through all my songs, and to my dismay, I've never written a song about cancel culture before. It's kind of a niche topic, but I do have a couple songs I want to share. This one's a fictional story of two brothers who cut themselves off over differences and over hurt. And at the end of their life, they rethink that decision. And it's called Line in the Sandbox. Can I come play with you on your side of the sandbox with all of your friends? We could build castles and show our mother. She'll smile at the work of our hands. But you drew a line in the sand. You drew a line in the sand. to the beach house. I said I forgot to call you, but really I just didn't want you around. I drew a line in the sand. I drew a line in the sand. Thanksgiving dinner, we met at our parents' house. Hadn't seen you in a while. Facebook posts in November, votes keep us on separate sides of the aisle. We drew a line in the sand. We drew a line in the sand. I drew a line in the sand. We drew a line in the sand. Now that I'm old, I sit by the phone and I muster the courage to call you. I don't know why, but I started to cry, 'cause I just didn't know what to say. As the tears came down, they watered the ground, and I watched as the lines washed away. We watched as the lines washed away. Can I come play with you on your side of the sandbox with all of your friends? Thank you. Well, I appreciate this conversation, and it's something that I think about a lot. And I don't know that I've landed yet, because I can see both sides. But I think that family is a container where, at least in our family, I hope that we can practice unconditional forgiveness. And I'm lucky to be part of an extended family where we have Republicans and Democrats and atheists and Christians, and we have family reunion every 2 years, and all those people get together, and we share a space together, and in all its awkwardness. It's not like a happy-go-lucky time all the time. I've overheard some interesting conversations, but I think that what makes me sad is when people and families cancel each other, and that's kind of what inspired that last song. This one's kind of the reverse, and it's a song inspired by a friend and about how love doesn't let go. It's called Lacey, You Don't Have to Tiptoe. Lately, you've got them clouds in your eyes, heavy laden, waiting for some stars to align. Lacey, you've been high for a while, in a hazy meditation, lost in your mind. Let your guard down like tears on the phone. You're never alone. Make your scars count. Those thorns on your soul could give up their hold. You don't have to tiptoe. Tracing all of your pain to the source, from a broken family system. You don't have a choice. Bracing for supper time, civil war. If you float right down the staircase, he won't hear your voice. Let your guard down like tears on the phone. You're never alone. Make your scars count. Those thorns on your soul could give up their hold. You don't have to tiptoe around your feelings. I ain't gonna let go. I'll be right here. Let your guard down like tears on the phone. You're never alone. Make your scars count. Those thorns on your soul could give up their hold, yeah. Let your guard down like tears on the phone. You're never alone. I hope you'll make your scars count. Those thorns on your soul could give up their hold. You don't have to tiptoe. You don't have to tiptoe. Lacey, you've got them clouds in your eyes. Thank y'all.
Paul, thank you so much. You have a website. Is it?
I do. It's my name, pauldeemer.com.
PaulDeemer.com if you want to find out more about Paul's music and where he's playing. And also, he has music here this evening for sale. It's over by the snack table, so please check out what he's brought this evening. All right, we're going to welcome Bob back up to answer questions. Okay, and what I'm supposed to do, sorry, you can tell I'm a little on the fly here, is let you know that Bob's going to go through all the questions that he can in 20 minutes. If we have to wrap up the evening, he is going to be staying around. So if there's something he didn't get to and you want to ask him about it, please stay and he'd be happy to entertain those. So Bob, would you like to come on up?
Wow, lots of good questions. Way more than I could do in 20 minutes. If I don't get your question, feel free to try to grab me afterwards, and I'll be happy to engage them. One of the questions I got, I was so thankful for because it was one of the pieces I skipped in the interest of time. I had somebody ask, are there any scripture passages that are relevant that would help us on this? Or what's the closest one? And that one I would say obviously there's no passage on cancel culture per se, but there is a passage on correcting people, right? The passage from Matthew 18, that is the passage where I think there are some things we can learn from it, because on the one hand, it's a passage that talks about where somebody has gone off track from whatever the community's norms are on that, and how that's to be dealt with. And part of what it says is go to them privately and confront them about it and work with them on it. And then if they don't listen to it, then bring in the larger community. And there are people that are saying that exact thing with respect to cancel culture and dealing with it. And so let me just give you a couple thoughts on that. This was the part I had to skip over. But Loretta Ross, the professor I mentioned a little bit earlier, she talks about this. She says that she would talk about the power differential. We didn't go into that, but she would say that this really applies, using social media the way that gets used in cancel culture should really apply when there's a power differential where you're not dealing with an equal. You're dealing with a situation where it's somebody that's beyond, their power is way above, and you're trying to work with whatever that situation is. But so this is how she says it. She would reserve call out for people who have more power than us, who are otherwise inaccessible. But if we perceive some dangerous error by somebody we can reach who has the same amount of power as us or less, then she says that we should contact them privately rather than publicly, with the goal of correcting them rather than crushing them or shaming them. And she said that, but there are other authors who say similar things. And the phrase I'd never heard of before I started doing this research that people are starting to use is call in rather than call out. It's a call in. So it's trying to get with them, to work with them on these different ways that you see things and trying to correct them from a different kinds of place. Only as a last measure then would it go public. And some of the Christian writers that I've seen writing on cancel culture have given the example of what takes place in 1 Corinthians 5. You may forget how kind of this racy passage of Scripture, because we probably have never heard a sermon straight up on it, but it's this passage where in 1 Corinthians where Paul is writing to the Corinthians saying, yeah, like, I've heard about this guy that's sleeping with his stepmom. This is in Scripture, guys. And you guys all know it, and you're really not done anything with it. That's kind of what Paul is saying. And Paul is saying you need to treat him as an unbeliever as a way to try to call him back and to help him. But the thing I would point out about that is, in that passage, is that Paul is all about trying to restore the person. He's all about, let's do this to try to help him for eternity, kind of a thing. His motivation is restoration and help, and it's not just some kind of mean, I'm going to put them on the outside and shun them that way. So thank you for giving me that question. Jesus was about the marginalized, right? Doesn't the cancel culture help the marginalized? Great question, thank you. Jesus, if you go read his mission statement, a lot of people will say in Luke 4 that's his mission statement, where he says, Mary and I went to seminary together, and we had a professor who made us memorize that passage from Luke 4 as our final exam. So it was the passage where Jesus takes up from Isaiah and reads it in the synagogue and says, where Jesus says, the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news, a release for the captives, and hope for the poor, and all these different kinds of things that he says about all the different people that are basically marginalized and helping them. That's his mission statement. And I certainly think that there's that passage, but then there's also how Jesus spent time with all the people that society said don't spend time with, the tax collectors and the controversy of the woman that is not highly regarded, who washes his feet and dries it with her hair, and all these different kinds of things are happening. Jesus was criticized for all of those things, and he did hang out with the marginalized, and he did care about it, and that was clearly a big part of what his mission was, if not, a main part of what he did in terms of his mission statement. So I agree with that part of it. So yes, I'm with you on that. So then the question is, does this help the marginalized? Should we be supporting it more? I think that's a great question. Like, if this is something that we should care about everyone in society, we should care about the dignity of all people. We should be the voice for the people who aren't having their voice heard well. But if this helps with that, is it something that's a good thing? I mean, this is part of our discussion as it fits in all these different kinds of pieces. I certainly think it should call us to attention and to focus on these kinds of things. Let's see, I think that's the final part of the question. I wrote my own handwriting. Now I can't read my own handwriting. So I think that's probably it. I mean, I think it's a good thing in that there are circumstances where somebody has no power that it helps. It could be a good thing. So I'm not really willing to say it's all bad. I'm not saying that. What I would rather say is that we, the church, ought to be about the marginalized, and we ought to be trying to be the voice. Wherever we are, we ought to be trying to do that. The next question: If someone is convicted of pedophilia, they are essentially canceled. Do you still say no to canceling them? Well, let me first start by saying who if anybody has been abused by someone, let me just start by saying sorry and what a horrible thing that is. And I think that part of what Christians try to do is maximize love. Like we're called to be a people known by love. And so part of our challenge is with whatever we counter, we're trying to figure out how to love. And so, but it's not only loving each individual, but it's also loving the collective. And so we have to be okay with, I think, some laws in society that are about safeguarding things. And certainly I feel super strongly that we have to protect the innocent. That's part of what we have to do. And also to recognize the other side of this is that people who've been impacted by abuse, sexual abuse, also are affected for the rest of their lives. So you're weighing lots of different kinds of things. And my understanding, we do Safe Church, we do lots of different kinds of training in the church on these kinds of issues. The latest thing that I've been told for years is that the science says somebody that's in that category, there's no healing for them. So what we're dealing with is loving them, is trying to figure out how they can be in society but not be harmful to society. So making them register and in a sense be called out that way for life, the science would back it and say that's okay, and that it's maybe in that sense it's the best for society. So I'm going to say, yeah, I think that's probably okay. I will say I did read recently, as I read through some of the legal stuff, that there was a court not long back in Colorado that just in the last little bit that said that it was unconstitutional as being inappropriate punishment, and that got flipped on appeal. But so I hear what you're saying, but I think that's like a whole nother category, if I can say it that way. And I think there's science and other things that are weighing in on that one. So I think I'd feel comfortable in saying, and I would also actually challenge one part of the question. I don't think you're canceling them. I don't think you're canceling the person. You're just saying with what's going on with you, society needs to know where you live and what's going on with that. I don't think it's canceling them. I think they can still get work and do things. I don't think it's completely canceling them. Someone asked the question, does cancel culture impact you? Yes, I'm up here speaking. I couldn't find anybody to speak. But yeah, I think it does. I think it does, because I think for sure, I'm, in all truthfulness, I mean, I'm anxious about giving this talk tonight. And I'm anxious about how open can we be in debate? And are you allowed to ask that question? I mean, I didn't give some of the examples that I read in preparing for this, but there are people who've been sort of canceled, as we know that term, for asking questions, not just for making statements, but just for asking the wrong question or something like that. So I think it does affect me, because I think I am aware of how careful we need to be. And some of that's good, because we want to be careful. We don't want to do things that are hurtful, but it's a balancing thing, right? Next question. Why has this concept become so relevant in our society? I think again, that's a great question. I wonder if this isn't, I mean, there are a couple ways you could look at this. the cynic could say there's a new avenue for a power grab, and that's why it's become relevant. There are other people that could say, well, there's a pressure point here that was overlooked, and now there's a voice to it. And what we need to do is get beyond our own personal hurts or whatever it is in the whole thing and listen and figure out what this is. It doesn't do any good for society for when we have a group of society that's really hurting and we're ignoring it. So I think there may be some good in it that way. But I don't know, there's a lot of pressure behind it. And I think one of the active questions I have, I'm not trying to give an answer to this, is it just a power grab by some? They've got this newfound power of what they can do and how that they can control. Or is it built up pressure from things that the rest of society, the people who've run the systems, have ignored? And I think we've got to do a lot of praying and thinking and working and listening on those kinds of things. And as I've said before, one counselor says, sit with the pain. I think there's part of that's what we need to do, is sit with the pain on that one. This one says, where do you think there is or should be a line between cancellation and freedom of speech? And I don't know. I'm not completely sure I understand the question. Let me just read it one more time. Where do you think there is or should be a line between freedom or cancellation and freedom of speech? I think what it's saying is, should you be able to say anything you want without being canceled? I think that's kind of where that's going. But I mean, I think obviously this is a well-developed area of law about freedom of speech, because there are things you cannot say. You know, everybody knows the screaming fire in the movie theater and all those kinds of things. But by and large, a democratic society we need healthy debate. We need healthy discussion and debate, and we need people that can say. I really think that one of the articles I read recently was talking about how they felt like so many colleges now have become assimilation centers rather than universities teaching people to critically think on both sides of issues. And the idea that the old debate structure where you showed up and you didn't know which side you were going to debate, you had to be ready to debate either side, is something that we're losing because people double down so hard on what their position is. I think we ought to be able to have the freedom of ideas, and I think that's part of what we're built on as a society, and I think it's ultimately healthy and good for us. That's my thought. Take it for what it's worth. I'm getting further into trying to read handwriting. How do we get culture to separate valid and important movements like Me Too versus immaterial childish behaviors that took place long ago in one's past? I appreciate that question. Yeah, so you have on the one hand people who 30 years ago did something silly in college when their frontal lobe was still developing and their judgment wasn't great, versus the idea that there are some really big things like the Me Too movement. You know, I don't know if I have an answer for this. How do we get culture to separate those? I don't know. Maybe we talk about it more. I mean, clearly those are markedly different, you know. And along with that are discussions about the norms that we have today, that society has today, are not the ones we had 30 years ago, you know. And I think about, you know, some of the people who've had a hard time in culture in the last decade are so lucky because they dealt with their issues before cancel culture really got going, like Trudeau in Canada. Like his whole blackface thing he went through, if that happened today, would he survive it? He barely survived it then, right? How many years ago it was? I mean, but we keep bringing things back from the past that way. I think that's a great point. And I think, how do we do it? I think we have to keep talking about it. These are different things. I think we've got to let children be children. We have to allow people to grow. If you stop letting people grow, I mean, what a terrible thing to tell someone you cannot grow. You're locked in at age 16 when you did that tweet or whatever it is. And, you know, I don't know, this is from the IP lawyer side for a second. You know, one of the things I love about some of the laws developing in Europe, which we don't have here, is like the right to be forgotten. So Europe has got these things where they're getting more into saying you ought to be able to go back and erase that stuff and require that these places get rid of the things you want to get rid of, because you ought to have a chance to not be locked into whatever you did when you were 16 or whatever else it is. The right to be forgotten. And I wish we would go to that place and get rid of some of those things. So thank you for that. How do you address this with younger generations, the people who were raised with the internet in their hand? Well, I think, I don't know. I mean, so my boys are rising juniors in high school, twins. And so I just got to say, ever since junior high, they've been raised with some of this awareness starting. And the schools that they were at talked about digital hygiene. And I think that's a thing, right? I think that's a thing you have to know. I mean, you read these stories like this one I started with today, when these tweets when he was 16 came back to haunt him so much. But you have to have the discussions. Like, sitting on it doesn't help anything. We have to go back and be able to talk about, at least for now, until we get, I'm starting to advocate now for the right to be forgotten. But until that happens, everything you do is out there. And so you don't have a choice. You have no choice but to talk to your grandkids or kids or whoever about, like, do not put anything out there, because it'll be out there, and someday, 10 years later, some reporter's going to go find it, and you're going to be on the front page, and all these different kinds of things. So I think you just have to open discussions. And the tensions that we're talking about between giving voice to the marginalized, giving accountability to the people who haven't had it, and all these other things about how it squelches debate, bring them into it. Like, bring them right into that discussion, but make it clear to them that for now, whatever they say and whatever that record is going to continue to be there and continue to stay. I don't know. Those are some of my thoughts. Social media generates such instantaneous amplification or opportunities for injustice, absence of review. How can it be slowed down? I think one of the bigger questions that somebody has engaged recently, that one of the articles was, like, is social media itself even good? Like, the whole thing is how fast it is, and do people really think? And I don't know the answer to this. How do you slow it down? Maybe take your time in responding. I don't have a strong answer on. I don't know what to say on that one. How to slow it down? That's part of the deal. Is it's so quick, and people don't always give deeply thoughtful answers on what they do and how things go. Sorry, I didn't see this one. This one says that I should lengthen the sermon of "You Are Special" by Max Lucado and read it twice till everyone hears it. And P.S., the circles were actually dots. Okay, sorry. I didn't. Thank you for that. It's actually a good book. Yeah. Next question says, is pulling Trump from Twitter an example of canceling the person or the activity? Yeah, so I'm hearing some people say both, but I think it is that's a good example, and I don't want. People are so polarized around that I'm reluctant to want to go too deep on this. But the idea that some people would say the January 6th activity is the reason they pulled this stuff from him. Other people would say that it's focused on him for all the stuff that happened for 4 years. I think it was interesting, if you followed all this, how Facebook ended up putting ultimately they abandoned him permanently, right, initially, and then they put it to an independent committee that came back and said in 2 years he'll be back on. So I think they actually did put in some kind of a corrective action on it. I think that's probably right. Whoever said both, I think it's probably both. I think they're responding to what happened January 6th, and they're also responding to the 4 years as they see it in him. All right. Let me see if I can read this one. What about those individuals that have done something often considered cancelable that refuse to be canceled? For example, the governors. of the Northern Virginia, Virginia and Como of New York, don't they have the opportunity to redeem themselves and do meaningful work in favor of the counselors? All right, hang on, I'm reading this. So they refuse to be counseled. So I think one of the interesting questions on this, before I even kind of engage this, there are people out there who talk about people that are not cancelable because of their power and their wealth or their ability to maneuver. And that gets super complicated, because is that about their power in terms of money or in their positions? Is it about their race? Is it about all these different kinds of things? And there are lots of different examples that people will give. Some people will get into things like, let me think of one of the examples. One of the examples might be Kevin Hart, who did a tweet, again, one of these long ago tweets, where he made some comments about hoping that his son wasn't gay or something like that. I think that's what it was. And then because of that, he had to pull out of hosting the Oscars, but he wasn't canceled, is what a lot of people would say, because he was able to come back and do shows, and he was able to continue to going, but he lost out on the Oscars, but he didn't lose everything. He didn't lose his platform. Was that because he's successful, wealthy, powerful, race? What was that? I don't know. But there are certain people who don't get canceled. And so the idea that there are certain people who refuse to be canceled, I mean, nobody wants to be canceled, but there are people who don't get canceled, and what goes into that. That's a whole complicated discussion, I think. I think everybody that gets canceled has the ability to try to make at least try to work to redeem it some way. I think that, another one of the things that we believe as Christians is that God can redeem every situation. Not that he causes it, but this one passage we always come back to, it always comes up when you're talking about how things happen in life. But that Romans 8:28 that says all things work for good with those who love God and are called according to his purposes, is this passage that comes up. And there are two camps on that passage. There are those who think that God kind of handles things, so whatever happens in your life, he's causing it. Don't worry about that terrible thing that happened. Don't worry about that death or whatever else, because God's somehow using it for your good. That is, I'll agree with whoever just said that, who just said it was BS. But there are people who I respect who think otherwise. I've said before, two theologians I love are on different sides of this, about whether God does all this. So I appreciate the church has not made a dogma that there's variety on this. But those, I'm in the camp that says I struggle to buy that. But what I do believe is that passage says that whatever happens to you, if you surrender it to God, he can make some good come out of it. If it was the worst tragedy there is, if you surrender it, you can go help other people with it. You can help people who are in that same situation. You can have a voice you wouldn't have had before. Whatever it is, there are all kinds of different ways that God can use it if you surrender it to him and offer it to him to be able to use it. And so I think when somebody gets canceled, there are all kinds of ways that it could be turned towards good, and that something good can come out of whatever happens with it. So I think I have one left. I don't know. I'm shocked that I've gotten through all these. I stuck it in actually, there are two, and they're both in the same direction, so I was going to put these down. The first one of these, this one came from online, said, is cancel culture in any way related to historical monuments? And then this question said, do you think historical figures who did good but also bad should be honored? For example, Thomas Jefferson. And this question, I think it's a great question. Because it brings in about 5 different issues, I think, all at once on these different things. Because one, we're bringing today's standards back to whenever the time was. That's the first thing that we're doing. So is that fair? Is it fair to say, because today, if you could take some of those people back here and they could see how it is and develop and do all this, they would be like, oh, I wouldn't do that. But that's what they did back then. So should you not do it? And some of the complaints are they didn't do anything necessarily really bad, but they didn't do enough. That becomes hard. and all the different kinds of questions that get raised like that. But like Thomas Jefferson, it's interesting to look back at him, for example, all these fantastic, amazing documents that he helped produce that so impacted our culture, but he didn't do enough. I mean, he was for freedom and all this stuff, but he didn't do enough. Like one of the things he did that was egregious, he had one of his friends offer to give a whole bunch of money to purchase some slaves to let them free, and he didn't accept it, or things like that. There are things that he did that are just like, what? What do you do with that? And I'll give some other examples on that. Like there are also, I think it's going to be an interesting decade, because you think about some of the great, great people that we so admire. I admire. You think about people like Martin Luther King Jr., just for example, that you've got all these streets named for him and all these great, who wouldn't say something good about him? But there's these things you don't want to talk about. And my understanding of that is why I say it's going to be an interesting decade, is because I think about 6 years from now, a whole bunch of the FBI records are going to finally be released. Because, Hoover did stuff that probably wasn't right. I don't think it was warranted. I don't think he had a warrant for it. But he recorded his conversations and did all this, and there's all these allegations about things he did that are going to be way more clear in about 6 years. And that's one of the complicated things we're going to deal with. And here's one of those things where I think we stop for a second. Christians, above all people, ought to be willing to say, to go back to one of the things I said is one of our main tenets, we recognize in the first couple chapters of Genesis, we're both good and bad. That we have the image of God, we're made in the image of God, but we've fallen. And it should be no surprise to us that we see people who do really, really good things who also have done some questionable things, and how that all works out. And the question is, and we ought to also be really good with moral ambiguity on some stuff, right? We've got Jesus, who is in the line of David, and the scripture goes out of the way to talk about this, but David is this big character, a man after God's own heart and all this kind of stuff. But let's talk about that Bathsheba thing for a second, however you want to say that power play was wrong, evil, And there are people who recount that who'll say that he raped her. I don't know how you go back and read that, but here he is, and then he's touted. He pays his consequences, and stuff that it has its own complications to talk about what happens with his child dying and all the other stuff. But this idea of you go through all kinds of places in Scripture where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you go back and start talking about stealing of blessings and all the different shenanigans that take place. We ought to be okay with some moral ambiguity. I think maybe the problem is maybe we haven't been honest enough about it. Maybe we haven't been honest enough. Maybe we've held up saying every Christian ought to be perfect and people ought to be perfect. But now in today's society, when it's not Christendom anymore, we ought to be the ones saying, look, people are not perfect. Nobody's perfect except for Jesus, and he's the Lord. And we ought to be okay with saying can you imagine a funeral for a second? Can you imagine a funeral where you're not going to be able to say anything good about somebody who did something bad? We have silence at every funeral. Every funeral is going to be silence. Really. And for the people who want to say all these people need to come down, I think we need to be able to hold up the good things that people do and say, people are made in the image of God, people do good things, and hold that up. And I don't think we should hide that they do bad things. I think we ought to be able to say, but it's a mixed bag. People do bad things, but we ought to be able to hold these things up. And if we have to have perfection before we're going to have any honor for anybody, there are going to be a lot of silent funerals and there's going to be no schools named for anybody. Really. I'm just saying. So anyway, my hope is I've given you some things to think about, and so you can have some conversations as you go into the week, and that we can really continue to debate. Is this a good thing, a bad thing, and what is the Christian response to it, and how do we lean into this with love and respect for the dignity of all people and trying to make the world a better place to the glory of Jesus. Good night. Thanks.